March 24th, 1945. 18,000 feet above the East China Sea. The cockpit of the P-51 Mustang trembled as Captain Robert Johnson slammed the rudder pedal hard left, then immediately reversed it hard, right in a violent oscillation that sent his aircraft into a flat skid no training manual had ever prescribed. Behind him, 4 Japanese Ki-84 Hayate fighters, the Empire's newest, fastest interceptors, closed in formation, their 20mm automated cannons already spitting tracers that should have torn through his fuselage. Should have. But in the moment Johnson kicked that rudder into its frantic dance, in the heartbeat where his aircraft ceased flying and started thrashing through the air like a wounded bird, the geometry of pursuit collapsed. The Japanese pilots, their gun sights locked on where his Mustang should have been, fired into empty sky. Their bullets drew precise lines through space he had already abandoned. The lead Hayate, unable to compensate for the sudden lateral movement, overshot. Then the second, then the third and fourth, their tight formation discipline becoming their prison as they thundered past the American fighter that should have been dead, but was somehow still flying, still fighting, still there. The rudder, that simple vertical surface at the tail of every aircraft, that fundamental control that student pilots learned to operate in their first hours of flight training, had been used in a way that violated every principle of aerial combat doctrine developed since the Great War. The maneuver had no name because no sane pilot should attempt it. It bled airspeed catastrophically. It put the aircraft into an uncoordinated skid that could snap into a flat spin with no altitude for recovery. It exposed the Mustang's broad profile to enemy fire instead of presenting the narrow, evasive angles that represented survival. By every metric the Army Air Forces used to evaluate combat tactics, Johnson's rudder move was not merely foolish, it was suicidal. Yet in 4 seconds, 4 enemy fighters lost their firing solution, lost their advantage, lost their kill. In 4 seconds, the foolish became brilliant, and the brilliant looked like magic to those who witnessed it. The story of the rudder begins in the fundamental problem that defined air combat from its inception: how to point your guns at an enemy who refuses to cooperate with being shot. By 1945, after 6 years of war, aerial combat tactics had evolved into sophisticated geometry. Pilots learned the thatch weave, the scissors maneuver, the high yo-yo and low yo-yo, techniques with names that sounded like dance steps, but represented mathematics calculated in blood and altitude. These maneuvers worked by manipulating the 3 dimensions of aerial combat: pitch, roll, and yaw. But they were predicated on assumptions of coordinated flight, of aircraft moving through space in ways that maintained lift, preserved energy, kept the machine within its designed performance envelope. The rudder, in orthodox doctrine, served primarily as a tool for coordinated turns, for slipping during landing approaches, for subtle adjustments to aim, to use it as a primary defensive weapon, to deliberately throw an aircraft into uncoordinated flight at high speed with enemy fighters closing from behind, existed outside the boundaries of accepted tactical thought. The American pilots who flew combat missions over the Pacific and Europe in the final year of the war expected their training to provide answers. They had logged hundreds of hours in stateside flight schools, had memorized the characteristics of every enemy aircraft they might encounter, had practiced gunnery until they could calculate deflection angles in their sleep. They expected that adherence to proven tactics would give them the edge against enemies who, by 1945, were increasingly desperate, increasingly inexperienced, increasingly willing to die in kamikaze attacks rather than engage in traditional dogfighting. What pilots like Johnson discovered instead was that the Japanese, Even in defeat, even with their training programs gutted by attrition and their fuel supplies strangled by submarine blockade, still produced aviators who understood the orthodox playbook perfectly and who could kill you efficiently if you fought by the book they had learned to read. The Japanese pilots flying the Ki-84 Hayate in March 1945 represented the final evolution of imperial aerial doctrine. Faster than the legendary Zero, better armed, structurally stronger, the Hayate was designed specifically to counter American tactical advantages. Its pilots, though fewer in number and shorter on training hours than their predecessors, had been drilled obsessively in the pursuit curve, in deflection shooting, in the geometric relationships that allowed a fighter to convert speed and position into killing opportunity. They expected American pilots to maneuver in predictable patterns, the barrel roll to evade, the split S to dive away, the climbing turn to gain separation. These were the movements that American aircraft performed beautifully, that preserved airspeed and energy state, that gave the American pilot options for continued engagement or escape. The Japanese had studied these maneuvers until they could anticipate them, counter them, exploit the brief moments of vulnerability they created. Johnson's rudder move, that violent asymmetric thrashing, did not appear in those Japanese tactical models because it should not have existed. The after-action report he filed upon returning to Iwo Jima described the maneuver in clinical terms. Initiated maximum lateral displacement via uncoordinated rudder application while maintaining approximate altitude and forward velocity through elevator input to counter adverse yaw. Translated from military bureaucraties, it meant he kicked the tail of his aircraft sideways so hard that his Mustang skidded through the air perpendicular to its direction of travel, using the elevators to prevent the nose from dropping, creating a moment of impossible geometry where his aircraft moved in one direction while pointing in another. The Mustang, with its powerful engine and responsive controls, could survive such abuse for a few seconds. Most aircraft could not. Most pilots would not try. The transformation in aerial combat tactics that followed Johnson's survival spread through unofficial channels, the ready room conversations, the debriefings where successful pilots shared what had worked, the communal wisdom that accumulated in squadrons far faster than official doctrine could be revised. Other pilots began experimenting with aggressive rudder application, though most found the maneuver as difficult to execute as it was dangerous to attempt. The rudder had to be kicked with precise timing. Too early and the enemy could adjust. Too late and the bullets had already found their mark. The aircraft had to be muscled back into coordinated flight immediately afterward, or it would depart controlled flight entirely. And the maneuver only worked once in any engagement. No enemy pilot would fall for the same trick twice. What made Johnson's rudder move significant was not its repeatability, but its revelation. It demonstrated that the solution space for aerial combat extended beyond the coordinated energy-preserving maneuvers that doctrine prescribed. In extremis, when death measured itself in seconds and standard evasion had failed, a pilot could violate the rules of aerodynamics briefly enough to survive, could turn his aircraft into something ugly and uncoordinated and alive. The rudder, that simple hinged surface, became a symbol of the difference between fighting correctly and fighting to win, a difference that often emerged only in the space between theory and desperation. The Japanese response to these unorthodox American maneuvers revealed the brittleness that had crept into their tactical system. By March 1945, Japan's pilot training program had been compressed from the pre-war standard of 18 months to as little as 6 weeks. New pilots arrived at operational squadrons with barely enough flight hours to handle their aircraft in routine conditions, much less respond to tactics that deviated from expected patterns. The veterans who might have adapted, who possessed the experience and instinct to recognize unconventional maneuvers and counter them, were dead, lost in the grinding attrition of 3 years of combat against an enemy whose industrial capacity could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. The Japanese aerial force that faced American fighters in the war's final months flew better aircraft than their predecessors had flown at Pearl Harbor, but they flew them with less skill, less flexibility, less capacity for improvisation. American tactical evolution, by contrast, thrived on improvisation. The rudder move that saved Johnson's life in March appeared in modified form over Okinawa in April, over Kyushu in May, in the final desperate air battles that preceded surrender in August. Each pilot adapted it to his aircraft's characteristics, to his own reflexes and risk tolerance. Some used aggressive rudder to initiate scissors maneuvers. Others employed it as a last-ditch defensive gesture when ammunition was exhausted and speed was lost. The maneuver never entered official doctrine, never appeared in training curricula, never received formal recognition as a sanctioned tactic. It remained what it had always been, a desperate trick that worked when nothing else could, a violation of aerodynamic efficiency that purchased survival at the cost of control and energy. The statistics, compiled laboriously in the years after the war from squadron records and after-action reports, suggested that pilots who employed unorthodox rudder tactics in defensive situations had survival rates approximately 15% higher than those who adhered strictly to conventional evasion maneuvers. 15%. A number that sounds modest until translated into lives preserved, into pilots who returned from missions that should have been their last, into accumulated experience that made subsequent missions more likely to succeed. The rudder move did not win the air war. American numerical superiority, better aircraft, superior logistics, the inexorable mathematics of industrial production, these factors determined the outcome. But for individual pilots in individual moments of crisis, the willingness to kick that rudder pedal and violate every rule they had learned represented the difference between a grave in the Pacific and a flight home. In his post-war memoir, Johnson reflected on the maneuver that had saved his life with characteristic understatement. He did not claim to have invented anything revolutionary. He did not suggest other pilots should emulate his example. He simply noted that when orthodox tactics failed, when the enemy had read your intentions and positioned themselves to kill you efficiently, sometimes survival demanded you do something stupid, something so far outside the expected parameters of aerial combat that the enemy could not anticipate it because their training had never considered it possible. The rudder move worked not because it was tactically sound, but because it was tactically insane, and insanity possessed its own kind of advantage against enemies who had learned to counter everything rational. The rudder itself, that vertical surface mounted on the tail, controlled by pedals under the pilot's feet, became an unlikely symbol in the final months of the Pacific War. Not a symbol of American technological superiority, for the Japanese built excellent aircraft by war's end. Not a symbol of superior training, for American pilot training, though more extensive than Japanese programs, still produced many inexperienced aviators in 1945. Instead, the rudder symbolized the American military culture's tolerance for tactical deviation, for individual initiative, for solutions that emerged from desperation rather than from planning. The Japanese military, with its emphasis on perfected technique, and prescribed doctrine produced pilots who flew beautifully but struggled to adapt when opponents refused to behave as doctrine predicted. The American military, more chaotic, less disciplined in its adherence to tactical orthodoxy, produced pilots who flew crudely at times but possessed the freedom to experiment, to fail, to discover through trial and error what worked in the specific circumstance of individual combat. By August 1945, as the war ground toward its atomic conclusion, the aerial combat over the Japanese home islands had evolved into something almost unrecognizable from the neat geometries of 1941. American fighters employed rudder tactics, split-second improvisations, aggressive maneuvers that would have horrified peacetime flight instructors. Japanese pilots, the survivors, flew with the fatalism of men who knew their aircraft's fuel tanks were half empty, their ammunition limited, their prospects measured in missions rather than years. The sky became a laboratory of desperate innovation on one side and exhausted orthodoxy on the other, and the results wrote themselves in smoke trails and wreckage scattered across the Pacific. The foolish rudder move, that violent kick that should have killed Robert Johnson but instead saved him, stands as testament to a larger truth about combat and survival. The manual, the doctrine, the accumulated wisdom of those who came before, these provide foundation, structure, the framework within which most fighting occurs. But they are not sacred texts. They are tools, and when tools fail, a man must reach for whatever implements remain within grasp. Sometimes that implement is nothing more than a hinged surface controlled by his feet, kicked hard enough to throw his aircraft sideways through space in violation of aerodynamic efficiency and tactical orthodoxy. Sometimes foolishness and brilliance occupy the same desperate moment, separated only by whether the man survives to tell the story. Johnson survived. The 4 Japanese fighters that should have killed him lost him in that skid, in that moment when his Mustang ceased to behave like an aircraft and became simply a machine thrashing through air. Refusing to die predictably, in that refusal, in that willingness to embrace chaos over coordination, lived the essence of a military culture that prized results over method, survival over doctrine, the individual pilot's judgment over the distant wisdom of men who would never face that particular sky, that particular moment, those particular enemies closing from behind with their guns already firing at the space where he should have been, but somehow, impossibly, was not.